Antwerp, Belgium, February 2003. A man in gray coveralls pushes a cleaning cart through a hallway lined with steel doors. Nobody looks up. Nobody ever looks up at the cleaning cart. He has been pushing this same cart down this same hallway for 14 months. Tonight, he is not cleaning anything. Tonight, he is carrying $200 million out the front door in a garbage bag. His name is Marcus Delvaux. By morning, the vault behind him will be missing 483 individual boxes of loose diamonds, gold bars, and uncut stones. The company that owns this building will spend the next decade insisting it never happened, because admitting it happened would end them. And the strangest part of this story isn't the diamonds. It's how he got in. He never picked a lock. He never cracked a safe. He got a job schedule, a piece of paper listing which cleaner covers which floor on which night. That's it. That's the whole weapon. So how does a man with a mop beat a vault that international insurers called impossible to rob? And why did it take the company 11 years to admit it happened at all? Marcus Delvaux is 39 years old in 2003. He has worked for a contract cleaning company for 6 years, rotating through office buildings, banks, and one diamond exchange building in the district everyone in Antwerp calls simply the Square. He is polite. He is forgettable. He brings his own thermos of coffee and drinks it alone in the stairwell during breaks. Nobody at the diamond company knows his last name. They know him as the cleaner, the guy with the cart, the guy who empties the bins on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Before the cleaning contract, Delvaux worked briefly as a locksmith's apprentice in Liège until the shop closed during a downturn in the trade. Before that, he did 2 years in the merchant navy, maintaining cargo hold mechanisms on bulk carriers, work that taught him more about mechanical seals, pressure locks, and confined space movement than most vault engineers ever learn on the job. He never advertised any of this. To the diamond company, he was a line item on an invoice from a cleaning contractor, renewed automatically every year without review. Nobody in procurement had ever met him. Nobody had ever asked what he did before this. He is not, by any account colleagues later give investigators, an angry man or a desperate one. He owns his small apartment outright. He has no debts, no known gambling habits, no criminal record beyond a minor theft charge from his 20s that never resulted in a conviction. What he has, according to people who work near him, is an unusual stillness, the kind of patience that makes a man easy to overlook. For over a year, he studies one specific room, not by breaking in, by being let in, over and over, as part of his ordinary job. He notices which nights the vault floor gets cleaned. He notices which guard signs the logbook thoroughly and which guard scrawls an illegible mark and moves on. He notices that the vault's outer door, the one visitors see when dealers come to check their boxes, is a fortress. Reinforced steel, a combination only 2 people know, a motion sensor grid covering the vault floor itself. But he also notices something else, something that takes him months of quiet observation to fully understand. The company installed all of that security around the vault door. Nobody thought much about the ventilation shaft that ran from the 3rd floor cleaning supply closet down into the vault's utility crawl space. Because on paper, that crawl space wasn't part of the vault. It was part of the building's mechanical systems, maintained by a separate contractor who had nothing to do with security, who answered to facilities management, not to the vault's own security division. 2 departments, 2 contractors, 2 sets of paperwork that never once cross-referenced each other. To understand why this building was considered untouchable, you need to understand what was inside it. The vault held safety deposit boxes for roughly 160 diamond dealers, the kind of small private firms that move stones between Antwerp, Tel Aviv, and Mumbai. Firms whose entire working capital sometimes sits in a single box the size of a shoebox. Officially, Insurers rated the vault's physical security at the highest tier available anywhere in the district. A steel door rated to withstand sustained explosive charges for over an hour. A combination lock requiring 2 separate key holders present at once. motion sensors blanketing every square meter of the vault floor, and a time-delayed release mechanism that made the door physically incapable of opening outside business hours, no matter who tried, no matter what pressure was applied. The insurance premium the Diamond Company paid reflected this confidence, lower than almost any other high-value vault in Europe, because the physical design made a break-in seem almost mathematically impossible. You would need explosives to get through the door. You would trigger motion sensors the instant you crossed the threshold. And you would need to do all of it inside a narrow window when the time delay allowed the door to open at all, a window that shifted daily and was known to only 2 people in the building. Nobody in the vault's 22-year history had ever gotten past that door. Not once, not close. So the sensors inside were tuned for one specific threat and one threat only, a break-in through that door. They were not tuned for someone who was already inside the room before the sensors ever engaged, because the vault's engineers, like most security engineers building a system to a specification, built a wall to keep intruders out. They never built one to keep an insider out from below, because on paper, there was no way for anyone to be below the vault floor without first passing through the door the entire system was designed around. The gap wasn't in the wall. It was in the assumption that the wall was the only way in. And that assumption had been true for 22 years, right up until it wasn't. The first thing Delvaux needed wasn't a tool, it was information. Specifically, the maintenance rotation schedule for the building's mechanical contractor, the crew responsible for the ventilation ducts and utility crawl spaces that ran beneath the vault floor. He found it the easy way. He asked. He told the building's facilities manager, a tired, overworked man juggling 3 properties, that his cleaning company wanted to coordinate schedules so the 2 crews wouldn't be working the same corridors at the same time, a request that sounded like basic professional courtesy, the kind no one questions. The facilities manager, glad someone finally asked, handed over a printed copy without a second thought and went back to his coffee. The schedule told him everything he needed. Which nights the crawl space access panel sat unlocked for routine inspection. Which nights security ran a reduced overnight patrol because the mechanical crew was expected in the building anyway, and reduced patrols meant fewer eyes, fewer footsteps, fewer chances of discovery. And critically, which 30-minute window each month the vault's motion sensor grid was powered down for scheduled testing, a maintenance procedure buried in a different document he'd photographed off a supervisor's desk months earlier while emptying a bin, the kind of paper nobody locks away because nobody imagines the cleaner reading it. He spent the next several months doing something almost boring, something that would look to any casual observer like nothing at all. Late at night, alone in the 3rd-floor supply closet on his ordinary cleaning shift, he unscrewed the ventilation grill and measured the shaft with a tape measure and a small flashlight held in his teeth. He mapped the turns. He counted the meters. He built a lightweight aluminum frame he could slide through the shaft like a sled, just wide enough for his shoulders, just strong enough to hold his weight and a canvas bag without buckling. He tested it twice, on nights when the maintenance schedule told him the crawl space panel would sit unlocked and unwatched. Both times, he went partway down, confirmed the route, checked for any sensor wiring he might disturb, and came back up before his shift ended, leaving no trace behind him, not so much as a scuff mark on the duct's dust. By the following February, he knew exactly which night the sensor grid would power down for testing, exactly which night security ran short-staffed, and exactly how long the crawl space panel would sit unlocked. All 3 conditions lined up once that year, on a single Tuesday night in the depths of a Belgian winter, when the streets outside were nearly empty by 9 p.m. He requested no time off. He clocked in for his ordinary shift at 7 p.m., pushed his cart down the 3rd-floor hallway as he had 1,000 times before, and disappeared into the supply closet like any other Tuesday. He drops into the shaft just after midnight. The aluminum frame holds. He moves in centimeters, not steps, easing himself down through 2 tight turns and a narrow vertical drop into the crawl space below the vault floor. The beam of his flashlight the only light in a space built for pipes and wiring, never for a man. He knows exactly which panel above him opens into the utility gap behind the safety deposit boxes, a gap the vault's architects left decades earlier for wiring access and never imagined anyone would use for anything else. He has 28 minutes before the sensor grid reactivates. He pries the panel loose from below, careful not to let it clatter against the concrete, sweat already beating despite the cold. He climbs up into the narrow space behind the boxes, a gap barely wide enough to turn sideways in, and begins working. Not on the box's individual locks. That would take too long for 483 of them, and he doesn't need to. He brought a cordless angle grinder wrapped in moving blankets to muffle the sound, and he cuts directly through the thin sheet metal backing of the boxes from behind, a weak point nobody designed for, because nobody ever imagined an intruder reaching them from that side.
Box after box, he reaches through the cut metal and empties the contents into a canvas duffel. Velvet pouches of loose stones, small gold bars stamped with foundry marks, folded paper packets of uncut diamonds still wrapped the way dealers wrap them for transport between cities. He works fast, methodical, checking his watch by flashlight every few minutes, the grinder's whine muffled to something barely louder than the building's own ventilation hum. He doesn't take everything. He takes what he can reach and carry in the time he has, prioritizing weight over volume, gold and cut stones over bulkier items he'd never managed to haul back up the shaft. At the 22-minute mark, he hears it. A door somewhere above them, on the vault floor itself. Footsteps. Slow, unhurried. A night watchman doing an early round. He doesn't usually run this early. Perhaps restless, perhaps simply bored. Delvaux freezes, one arm still inside a cut box, diamonds in his palm, breath held. The footsteps stop almost directly above him. A long pause, long enough that he starts running through what he'll say if the panel is somehow noticed, though there's no good answer. None at all. Then the footsteps move on, toward the vault's outer door, and fade down the corridor. He doesn't move again for almost 2 full minutes, listening, before he goes back to work with hands that are, for the first time all night, not entirely steady. By the 26-minute mark, with 2 minutes of his window left, he has emptied what he can reach. He pushes the panel back into place behind him, not perfectly, but well enough that a casual glance won't catch it.
The hardest part of any heist isn't getting in. It's leaving with the proceeds without anyone noticing you're carrying anything unusual at all. Delvaux doesn't run. He finishes his shift. He empties the last few office bins on the floor above exactly as scheduled, exactly as he has 1,000 times before, forcing his hands steady, his pace ordinary. At 6 a.m., he wheels his cart, now with a canvas duffel bag tucked beneath a folded stack of garbage liners, out through the loading dock the way he does every single morning. Past a security guard who waves at the same cleaner he's waved at for 6 years without ever really looking at him, without ever once wondering what might be under the liners. He does not fence the diamonds through underworld contacts the way most jewel thieves get caught within weeks. He has spent the preceding year quietly opening several small business accounts under a shell trading name, positioning himself to sell loose stones in small batches to legitimate wholesale buyers in Amsterdam and Antwerp itself. People who ask few questions about provenance when a seller has plausible paperwork and sells only in modest, unremarkable quantities that never trigger a compliance flag. Over the following 18 months, he liquidates the stones in dozens of small transactions, never selling enough at once to draw attention, never spending lavishly, never buying a new car or a bigger apartment. Continuing to show up for his ordinary cleaning shifts for another full year before quietly resigning, citing a family matter, and moving to a small coastal town in Portugal where nobody in Antwerp ever thinks to look.
Here is the part almost nobody expected. When the theft is finally discovered, weeks later, during a routine internal audit rather than any dramatic reveal, the diamond company does not call the police immediately. It does not issue a public statement, because admitting that nearly $200 million in stones vanished from the most secure vault in the district would mean admitting the vault wasn't secure at all, and that admission would collapse the trust of 160 dealer clients overnight, along with the company's insurance rates and possibly the company itself. For nearly a year, the company handles it quietly,
settling claims individually with affected dealers under strict non-disclosure agreements, patching the physical vulnerability without ever describing publicly what the vulnerability was, welding shut a ventilation path that had existed since the building was constructed. Insurers who eventually do get involved likewise have every incentive to keep the details out of the press, since acknowledging a gap of this kind in a facility they rated as top tier would raise uncomfortable questions about every other vault they insure across the continent. It takes investigators the better part of 2 years, working quietly and largely outside public view, to trace the pattern of small stone sales back through the Amsterdam wholesale market to a shell trading account, and from that account to Marcus Delvaux, by then long departed from the cleaning company and living under his own name, unhurried in a small house near the Portuguese coast, tending a garden, telling neighbors he was a retired maintenance contractor. He is arrested there in a joint operation between Belgian and Portuguese authorities and extradited back to Belgium to face trial, a process that itself drags on for months as lawyers argue jurisdiction and evidence chains.
At trial, Delvaux does not deny what he did. He describes it calmly, almost technically, the way an engineer might describe a design flaw rather than a crime. He never used a weapon. He never touched a combination lock or the 2-key vault door the entire building's security had been built around. He tripped no alarm because the alarm was never designed to imagine him. When the prosecutor asks him directly whether he considers himself a thief, he pauses and answers, "I consider myself the only person who actually read the building's blueprints." The courtroom, according to reporters present, goes quiet. He is convicted and sentenced to 8 years, a comparatively light sentence secured partly because his lawyers argue, with some success, that the company's own negligence, handing over an internal maintenance schedule to anyone who simply asked for it, coordinating 2 separate security systems that never once spoke to each other, was as responsible for the theft as anything he engineered himself. The judge, in her written ruling, notes that the case exposes a genuine gap in how the company defined its own security perimeter, though she stops short of calling it an excuse. Most of the diamonds and gold are never recovered. The company never fully discloses, even years later, the exact total taken, giving figures to insurers privately that differ from figures given to shareholders. Several of the dealer clients whose boxes were emptied quietly leave the exchange altogether rather than have their own undeclared holdings become a matter of public record, a fact that itself hints at how much of what disappeared that night may never have officially existed in the first place. So, was Marcus Delvaux a criminal mastermind, or was he simply the first person patient enough to notice that the most expensive security system in the world still depends entirely on which door someone decides to guard? He never broke a single mechanism the vault's engineers built. He just found the one door nobody thought to build a lock for at all,
And spent 14 months proving that the most dangerous person in any secure building is the one nobody bothers to watch. If you like these types of videos, be sure to check out our other videos on my channel, and don't forget to subscribe.